You're listening to the Catholic Wives Desiring Peace podcast. Today's episode is a letter to my younger self. Are you a Catholic wife grappling with challenging in-laws? The Catholic Wives Desiring Peace podcast is your sanctuary for navigating these sometimes stormy seas of life with toxic in-laws, while being validated for what you've experienced. Join me, your host, Miriam Susan, a Catholic wife who's weathered nearly 3 decades of in-law drama, as we tackle the tough issues you're dealing with head on. Hi, Miriam Susan here. August is a really big month for our family. We have birthdays and we have our anniversary, and it's just caused me to take some time to want to reflect, and it made me think about what are some things that I wish I had known, and if I could go back in time, I would tell my younger self. So that's what we're going to be talking about in today's episode. And to start off, one of the things that I would tell my younger self is be authentically you. It is so hard when you're young, and I was only 21 when my husband and I got married. I turned 22 just 10 days after we got married, and it was not the easiest time to be married, in the sense that I was so young. I didn't really know exactly who I was. And so it was very easy for me to try to mold and conform to other people's ideals of who I should be. And that's one thing that I would try to tell my younger self, is to be authentically you. Try to figure out who you are without trying to fit into what other people think. And like I said, I know that as a 21, 22-year-old young married woman, it was hard because I was away from family. My husband was in the military. We were living on our own, and it was just a very interesting time to be finding myself, because here I was, a new wife. And I was not only a new wife, but I was a new military wife. My husband was in the Air Force at the time. And there were just so many ways that I could have gone, so many directions I could have gone with my life. I could have gone on to get my master's degree in biology, or gone on to medical school or nursing school or any kind of other further education. And I didn't. And I think that in some ways I did get to be authentically myself. And a big part of that was living far away from both my family and my husband's family. Living in a place where there was considerable distance between us and our families allowed us to navigate our early married years on our own and kind of figure things out as we went along, without the added pressure of having to meet either of our families' expectations. I will say, though, that my family actually had surprisingly few expectations for me and my husband and what part we would play in, the extended family life. And not necessarily the case with my in-laws. There were expectations of regular visits and allowing them to come visit us. And it was just a really good thing, in my opinion, that when we got married, we were stationed far away from either of our families, because we were able to begin making our own family traditions, and they were just ours. We didn't have to necessarily mold and shape what we were going to do as a family based on what an extended family was doing already. Another thing that I would tell my younger self is, just because somebody says that they love you does not mean that their definition of love matches your definition of love. Now, what am I talking about? I'm not talking about my husband. I feel like I understand his definition of love, and his definition of love is definitely unconditional love. I'm mostly referring to my in-laws. Probably to this day, they would say that they love me, but their definition of love is not the same as mine. My definition of love is unconditional. I will love you, and it doesn't matter if you agree with me or not. It doesn't matter If you want to do things in a completely different way, that does not change whether I love you or not. My in-laws, through demonstrating with their actions and their words, have shown through the years that while they may say that they love me as their daughter-in-law, their actions have said something very different. I would never consider that slandering somebody else, gossiping about somebody else, is a form of love if I'm trying to create a harmonious relationship with someone. That's not part of the picture. And so while they can say the same words, I have learned that they don't mean the same thing to them as when I say them. When they say love, it seems to me that it is more appropriate to say, I enjoy manipulating you. I enjoy controlling you. I enjoy controlling your children. I enjoy having influence over your family. And to me, that's not love. One thing I will say about this idea that just because somebody says that they love you doesn't mean that their definition is the same as yours. You can love someone and not tolerate their behavior. That is not something that my in-laws seem to understand. I love my in-laws. I love them because they are fellow human beings. I love them because they are my husband's parents, and they gave him life and they raised him. I think they actually, in spite of everything, raised him reasonably well. Does he have issues? Yes, but they provided for him enough that he became the man that I fell in love with and am now married to. But Father Mike Schmitz has a really good video about like the 3 kinds of love that we can have as Catholics. And the first one is the one that I said. It is a basic love for fellow humans. It is one that I feel every person is owed just because they are made in the image of God. So that is a kind of love that I can genuinely say I have for my in-laws. I love them because they're fellow human beings, just like I love my next door neighbor, just like I love the person down the street, just like I love the person who's behind me in line at Aldi. Those people receive my love. The second level of love and respect is one that we give to people in a certain space of authority. So I love my in-laws as my husband's parents. I can love people in that way, and that is different than the third kind of love and respect that Father Mike points out in his video, and I'll share a link to that video in the comments. And that is one that is earned. There is a love that I don't have for my in-laws because I don't feel that they have earned it. They haven't earned my love and respect in the sense that I don't think that they understand how to treat their son. I don't think they understand how to treat me as their daughter-in-law or their grandchildren. And so there is a certain level of love that I do have for them and another level that I do not. I really would want my younger self to know and understand that yes, we can love one another as Christ calls us to, and yet not love each other in that depth that comes from having a good relationship with someone. If you have a broken relationship with someone, it's really hard to love them in that capacity. You can still love them as human beings. You can love them for the role that they play in your life or your husband's life. But that other kind of love, the love that is earned, the respect that is earned, that's one that they might not have. So sorry, got off on a little bit of a detour there. Let me come back to my list of things that I would tell myself if I were to go back in time and meet her today. I would also tell her that it is much, much harder to enforce boundaries years into your marriage than if you start off with them. Let me say that again. It is way harder to bring boundaries into play after you've not had them for a while, so it's better to start off with them. So us having lived about, it was probably a solid day and a half, 2 days drive from my in-laws and even longer from my parents, that was an excellent boundary. It was an actual physical boundary. We didn't have video chat at the time. We didn't have all of the ways to communicate. We didn't have cell phones. And so there wasn't this level of instant connectivity with family who lived far away. I mean, we didn't live that long ago that it was like, send message by carrier pigeon, but there was a level of privacy and distance there. And that boundary, I think, was really, really good for our marriage. So I would encourage any young couple who is thinking about getting married to really consider and pray about where you live those first few years of marriage, because that's when your family traditions start to solidify, and it gives you an actual physical boundary between you and your parents. Now, having boundaries early on, I think, is very, very good. If you have ever done any teaching, I substitute taught just a handful of times when I was in college to make a little extra money. And before we could substitute teach, we had to go through this special training program to become actual substitute teachers in the county where I lived. And one of the things that the teacher of this substitute teacher class told us was just this: start off firm with your class, and then over time you can loosen up. But it's really, really hard to walk in and be chummy and friendly with all the kids. And then if they start acting up, they're not going to respect you. And so I feel the same thing applies with our in-laws. If you start off your marriage by having your husband share maybe a little too much information about your financials, that's going to be hard to back out of. If you start going over to your family's house every weekend for lunch, for dinner, to even spend the night, that's going to be a really hard thing to back out of a few years later. So I would encourage you in those early years to really kind of insulate as a couple and focus on you. Focus on growing your marriage. If you have children right away, focus on learning how to be a good parent to those children. Now, I understand that many of us feel a little bit insecure when we have children, and so we do want to pick up any tidbits of wisdom that our parents or our in-laws or grandparents might have to offer, but it still needs to be your decision. And if you start to see some pushback on, well, I told you to do this with your baby and you didn't do it, and now there's problems, that's when it should be a red flag going off in your head and say, okay, we need to put some boundaries into place. So I would highly suggest, if I was talking to my younger self, to set up boundaries and stick to them. What is a boundary that I did not stick to very early on? It was allowing my in-laws to spend the night and stay with us under our roof when they came to visit. Now, I remember the very first time my in-laws were going to come to visit us. We were living on base and my in-laws were going to come. And I suggested to my husband, and he was very open to this, I suggested, why don't they stay in the hotel on base? If you're not familiar, military bases, military installations, pretty much all have some kind of lodging, some kind of hotel. And even if you're not military, at least this was the case when we were in the military. Granted, I know it's been a long time. Things have changed, but you could sponsor or you could allow a family member to stay in those lodging facilities while they came to visit. And so I suggested to my husband, it would probably be a whole lot more comfortable for your mom and dad and brother and sisters to stay in a hotel on base. They were super, super cheap. I mean, it was like less than half of what it would have cost for them to stay at a regular hotel, to stay at the one on base. They were very clean. They were very safe. They were very close. And that was met with crying on the phone. When my husband suggested, hey, mom and dad, we can put you up at the hotel on base. It's super nice. Tears and crying. started coming through the telephone lines, because for some reason it got twisted into, we can't even go stay with our son in his own home when we go to visit. It wasn't that. It was, let's have a boundary. And unfortunately, my husband was a young man at the time, newly married, and most men that I know don't do real well when women start crying. A lot of women know this and use it to their advantage. I think that was the case in that instance, that his mom decided to turn on the waterworks in order to manipulate my husband into allowing them to stay in our home. And they did. And at that point, our relationship, it's always been tense. It wasn't too terribly bad, but that was one of those little things that I didn't realize at the time was going to be hard to backtrack on years down the road. And that's what happened. Many, many times when we lived in different places around the country, guess what? My in-laws didn't stay anywhere else. They stayed with us. There was an exception. When my husband came home from his first deployment, they did stay in a hotel in town. But most of the other times when they came to visit us, when we were stationed in different places around the country, they stayed with us, unless we truly had no space for them. If we were staying in an apartment, there was an actual physical room, then they would bring a camper or something and they would stay somewhere else. But it was a really, really hard, quote unquote, tradition to break because we allowed that so early on. So if you are young, newly married, and you're listening to this podcast, number one, I'm sorry that you're listening to this as a young newlywed, because that means things are already not so great. But I would encourage you to find ways to have some boundaries just to protect your privacy and your marriage. Another thing I would tell my younger self is your children are yours to raise and protect. Everyone else comes second to you and your husband. Now, this was not a big issue for me because I've always kind of been the mom that the babies come back to me if they're crying. The babies come to me if it's time to sleep. The children come to me if there's any issues. I have always tried to be the number one person, aside from my husband, that the children went to. I didn't relinquish the need to console my children to anybody else. I think I did well in that area. A lot of young moms, especially if you are a little anxious, if maybe there is some postpartum depression, anxiety that goes along with it, where you might feel like you need to have a break and have somebody else kind of step in for you to have the space to heal yourself. Sometimes those doors get inadvertently left open, and toxic people can take advantage of that. Toxic people can take advantage of you being sick, you being depressed, you having anxiety, you having health challenges, anything like that. If you actually need help to physically take care of your children, toxic people can come in and really just kind of run with it. And so I would just remind myself, my younger self, your children, they are yours to raise and to protect. Everybody else comes secondary. There are two last things that I would tell my younger self, and they're opposite sides of the same coin. One of them is, you're not a bad daughter-in-law if you don't want to spend time with your in-laws. The second one, the flip side of that, is you're not a good daughter-in-law if you do spend time with your in-laws and you don't want to. So you're not a bad person if you don't want to spend time with your in-laws. That doesn't make you a bad person. And it doesn't make you a good person if you do spend time with them and you really don't want to. A lot of people will try to convince you that you are less than, you are not being a kind person if you don't want to spend time with somebody. But that's just your preference. It's not a sin to not spend time with somebody. If somebody is draining, if someone causes you stress and anxiety, you're not a bad person for saying no and not wanting to spend time with them. I really hated when my husband would go on hunting trips with his dad. I liked that he enjoyed spending time with his dad. I had nothing against him necessarily spending one-on-one time with his dad. But when he did, that meant that I had to spend a lot of, for lack of a better word, unsupervised time with his mom. And that was stressful. I didn't like it. It didn't make me a bad daughter-in-law for not wanting to spend time with her. And I wasn't a better daughter-in-law when I did because I didn't really want to. My motive wasn't right. It's all about the heart, right? If you spend time with someone that you really don't want to because you feel obligated, because you feel guilty, because you feel this burden to do so, is that really good quality time that you're spending with someone? I don't know. I don't think so. So just because you might be suffering and spending time with your in-laws, it doesn't make you a better person. A lot of times people will try to convince you that you need to be the better person and spend time with them. And what God does with that kind of suffering, I don't know. But if you're doing it without the right motives, if your heart is not in the right place, I don't know how God sees it. I would think he would not see it very favorably, but I don't know how he sees those kinds of things. But to me, it makes logical sense that trying to purposefully be a martyr and doing things like that doesn't necessarily get you brownie points, if you know what I mean. So that's what I would go back and tell my younger self. If I met myself when I was engaged and I was open to hearing from my older self, which I think would probably kind of be weird if I met my older version of myself and she came back to give me some advice, those are the things that I would say. Those are the things that I would let her know, that, watch out for people who say they love you and they don't love the same way you do. Keep some boundaries early on. It's a whole lot easier to keep them going when you start off in the first place with them. Be authentic. Be yourself. Don't try to mold and become somebody else that you're not. Just be you. Remember that your children, God gave them to you for a reason. You are the one called to raise and protect them. And then your status as a good or bad daughter-in-law, it doesn't depend on whether you spend time with your in-laws or not. I hope this is helpful. I hope that if you are a younger mother, younger wife, that this is helpful for you. And if you have any other things that maybe you think I should have included in this list, please let me know. Reach out to hello@desiringpeace.com. Let me know, what would you go back in time and tell your younger self if you could do that? I'd love to know. Until next week, God bless you. Go in peace. Thanks so much for tuning in to today's episode. If you've ever wondered just how toxic your relationship with your in-laws really is, I've got the perfect tool for you. Introducing the new free Toxic In-Laws Assessment, a self-graded quiz designed to help you identify the true level of toxicity in your relationship with your in-laws. Whether you're unsure if your in-laws are really that bad or you think they might be worse than you realize, this assessment will give you the clarity you need. Don't leave it to guesswork. Take the free Toxic In-Laws Assessment now and start your journey towards healthier and more peaceful family dynamics. Visit desiringpeace.com/quiz to get started. Disclaimer. All content and information on this podcast and our website, including our programs, products, and or services, is for information and educational purposes only and does not constitute professional medical, psychiatric, or mental health advice of any kind, and does not establish any kind of professional client relationship by your listening to this podcast or use of my website. A professional-client relationship with you is only formed after we have expressly entered into a written agreement with you that you have signed, including our fee structure and other terms to work with you in a specific matter. Although we strive to provide accurate general information, the information presented here is not a substitute for any kind of professional advice, and you should not rely solely on this information. Always consult a professional in the area for your particular needs and circumstances prior to making any professional, medical, or mental health related decisions.